Hello and welcome to my final project for LAS 2001. My name is Sam Huber and I am here today to talk about the country Cuba. I hope that you enjoy this presentation and learn something new. My goal today is to go over a basic profile of Cuba's history and geography, and then go more into detail about three important cultural cases in Cuba, which are religious freedom, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and expanding internet access, followed by a summary, and finally, a reflection. Cuba was first discovered in the year 1492 by Christopher Columbus during his famous journey where he found the New World. He claimed the land for Spain, and the island became home to a very important colony for the Spanish, as it was a major trade hub through the 16th and 17th centuries, serving as a stopping point for the many Spanish ships on the way to the American colonies on the mainland. From the 18th to the 19th century, Cuba's population boomed and the island's sugar industry increased, becoming the most mechanized sugar producer on the planet. Sugar made up 4/5 of Cuba's export, and the island was responsible for producing 1/3 of the planet's total supply of the valuable good at one time. In 1868, fed up with the increased taxes and the refusal of Spain to grant autonomy to the island, Cubans fought for independence for the first time. However, this conflict, the 10 Years' War, was not successful. Cuban independence would come a few decades later when, with the help of the United States, Cubans fought for independence a second time, in the year 1898, in what we now know in the US as the Spanish-American War. This government did not last for long, however. In 1959, another revolution was led by Fidel Castro, who established Cuba as we know it today, a communist country. The capital city throughout this rocky history has been Havana. The island is the largest in the West Indies archipelago, with over 3,500 miles of coastline and many protected parks and ecological areas, including several UNESCO World Heritage Sites, such as the beautiful Vinay Valley, as can be seen here. The three detailed cases that I am going to cover today are religious freedom in Cuba and how Cubans feel about religion today, the Bay of Pigs invasion as an example of American intervention in Cuban affairs, and expanding internet access across Cuba. While freedom of religion is included in the constitution that Castro's government put forth when it took power in 1959, it has not always been allowed as it is outlined in the document. Castro's regime cracked down on religion over the years, closing down churches, seizing their lands for the government, and deporting some religious figures. An early example of this was when Castro ordered the Jesuit school where he and his family had attended as children to be closed down. It is a requirement to be atheist to be a member of the Communist Party in Cuba. In 2005, almost 50% of Cubans still identified as Catholic, and with the induction of Pope Francis, more and more Cuban views of Catholicism are shifting back towards the more favorable, with the current ruler, Raul Castro, the brother of former leader Fidel, meeting with the new pope and saying that if anyone could get him back into the church, it would be him. Pope Francis also served as a host for a meeting between US and Cuban leaders in an effort to increase trade and good relations between the two countries. While some Cubans have been shying away from Catholicism in recent years, Raul Castro is not the only one who is a fan of Pope Francis. 8 out of 10 Cubans rated him positively in a poll. The Cuban government has also become more lax on its restrictions, allowing Christmas decorations for the first time, which had previously been completely banned, and in 2015 the first new church was approved for construction since Castro's government took power. Cuba's government has had a very troubled relationship with religion over the last few decades, but as it looks forward, it is going through another change and beginning to reopen itself to religion. One of the first things that most Americans think of when they hear Cuba is the Bay of Pigs invasion. This infamous example of attempted American intervention was a failed US-backed coup by Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro and replace his communist government with one more friendly to the United States interests. This map was used by the United States in the planning phases of this attack. The invasion took place in April 1961, and the attack began with the first in what was to be a series of two airstrikes flown by US pilots to destroy any Cuban air bases and ease the assault for ground forces. However, President Kennedy canceled the second round of these strikes at the very last minute, with planes fueled up and on the runway when the call came down to stop the strikes. This meant that some of the Cuban planes and air bases survived, and because of this the ground invasion was a complete and total failure, with the Cuban freedom fighters either captured or killed. Some of the survivors can be seen in this photo here. The entire event was seen as a massive embarrassment for the United States in the international community, and it increased the already high tensions between the United States and Cuba. The US government spent the next few years negotiating for the release of the remaining survivors from the attack, the last of whom were transferred back to US soil in 1965. The repercussions of this event are still felt today. The worsening relations between Cuba and the United States led to escalation and future conflicts, including the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year. The United States had a existing trade embargo with Cuba before the Bay of Pigs, but it continued to last for decades after. While these events were not a direct result of the Bay of Pigs invasion, this event was a catalyst for the further conflicts, and it escalated the bad blood that already existed between the two nations. While the countries had shared ideological differences before the attack, the Bay of Pigs solidified them as enemies for the remainder of the 20th century. While Cuba has technically had internet access since the 1990s, it had been extremely limited, and what access did exist was very slow. In 2013, the Cuban government slightly expanded access and began an email firm for its citizens. And in 2015, the country opened Wi-Fi hotspots across the island to allow for more public access to the internet, more of which were added over the next few years. The big change came in 2019 when private internet access was approved for homes and businesses. The connection is slow, it's only 3G, but it still has massive potential. While some sites are still blocked by government censors, this access allows new levels of communication with the outside world and between people on the island. Families that have been separated for decades can talk again, and Cubans can now exchange ideas with people across the world and can widen their worldview. Groups of like-minded activists for different causes, such as LGBTQ rights, animal rights, and many other social and economic causes, can now discuss and organize in much more efficient ways. Activists are already using it to organize events and protests right under the government's noses. And several Cuban influencers have risen to prominence, sharing their experience supporting their social causes. This expanded access has the potential to lead to more and more freedoms and changes in the future. Cuba is a country with a history that goes back to the discovery of the American continent. It has a history full of conflict and revolution. The repercussions of this have made it a country of radical change, and it is still feeling the impact of its past today, as can be seen from the long-term impacts of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And yet it is going through all new changes at the same time as it adapts to the world today. It is lessening its religious restrictions and taking on a new perspective on religion through the lens of Pope Francis and its new leader, Raul Castro. It is also expanding internet access, which has the potential to lead to exponentially more change as time goes on. In conclusion, Cuba is a country with a rich and vibrant culture, one that is often overlooked by people in the United States because of our limited access to it through the embargo. But despite this, Cuban culture has had a great impact on the US, particularly in Florida. In Miami, the Cuban-born population climbed 21% between 2010 and 2017, and Dade County alone has over 700,000 Cuban-born residents, a quarter of its total population. Cuban food, music, and art all have a large presence in the US and have had a large cultural and societal impact over the last few decades. In Gainesville alone, there are several Cuban restaurants, and many cafes and coffee shops serve Cuban coffee and other Cuban food goods, such as pastries. On the other hand, the United States has impacted Cuban culture in many ways as well. The aforementioned trade embargo has greatly changed Cuba's cultural development in comparison to other Latin American nations. One of the most famous popular culture depictions of Cuba is the classic car. Cuba is known for all of its classic 1950s-era cars that dot the island. This is because of the inability for new cars to be imported onto the island after the embargo was put in place. This led to Cubans adapting, fixing up the cars that were imported before the embargo, long after they would have been replaced with newer models in other countries. They took what should have been a limiting factor and turned it into a part of their cultural identity. Cuba will continue to grow and change, remaining a vibrant cultural beacon in the region and for the world as a whole. Thank you for listening. I hope that you have a new appreciation for Cuba's culture and the impact it has had on the region around it and the planet as a whole.